this lecture, I'm going to be dealing with Robert Nozick, who was born in 1938. In the lecture itself, I'm going to be very much focusing on his book, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Let me just explain what the structure of the lecture will be. I'm going to start with some preliminaries about Nozick's work and a little bit about Nozick himself. I'm then going to move to look at the starting point of Nozick's argument in the book. I will then turn to arguments that he presents for the legitimacy, but being okay, as it were, of a minimal state, one which is something which is a state, but which is very much limited in terms of the functions that it undertakes. I'll then turn to some of the challenges that he offers to those people who want a larger state and the involuntary redistribution of wealth, e.g. through taxation. I'll then turn to look at some of the critical reception of his work and at some changes in his views since Anarchy, State and Utopia was published. And finally, I'll conclude by looking at the final and, in my view, unduly neglected section of his book. First of all, then, some preliminaries. In the lecture, I'm going to focus on Anarchy, State and Utopia, really quite a controversial book written by Nozick, rather than on Nozick himself. I do this really because Nozick is a contemporary philosopher, much of the rest of whose work is dealing with just a variety of different, often technical problems within philosophy. And there's a sense in which Nozick is, in a way, personally disconnected from his most famous work, Anarchy, State and Utopia, in a manner that isn't true of many of the other people we're dealing with in this series. Nozick, indeed, has, in a sense, distanced himself from the book. He hasn't responded to criticisms that other people have made of it. He has changed his views a little bit. And in his particular case, I think, we get less knowledge about the work by knowing other things about Nozick and his career than may be the case with other authors. Let us then turn to his book. What happens if we take the idea that individuals have rights seriously? Robert Nozick starts his Anarchy, State and Utopia by saying, and I quote, "Individuals have rights, and there are things no person or group can do to them without violating those rights. But what follows from this depends very much what kind of view you have about what those rights are." Nozick understands them very much in the tradition of, say, John Locke or Thomas Jefferson, rather than in terms of ideas about modern notions of entitlements to welfare as an interpretation of rights. In his book, Nozick starts from a situation in which there are individuals with rights to their persons and rights to acquire property, but there isn't a government. He starts with a so-called state of nature, very much in the tradition of John Locke. Nozick argues that, from this starting point, a government that is limited in the scope of what it does, a so-called night watchman state, a bit like a night watchman that goes around and protects persons and their property, can be set up legitimately without infringing on anyone's rights. But, he claims, anything that goes beyond that, including in particular the involuntary redistribution of property, would be illegitimate. Nozick's book created quite a stir. It was pretty unpopular within the academic world. I mean, these aren't the kind of views that you normally find most professors as having. I mean, a few of them do, and they were very happy about it, but for the most part, it was unpopular within academia. The work, though, developed its themes with brilliance, with a lot of technical work, with using some neat examples as well, and so it was intriguing. There was a lot of stuff that provoked people. And above all, it created a stir because the author was a professor of philosophy at Harvard who before that had really a key reputation for doing different neat pieces of technical work within philosophy. This, though, leads me to a kind of problem in talking about the work. I mean, namely, that much of the stuff in the book is detailed and technical and rather clever in a sort of abstract sense. And this clearly isn't material that it makes very much sense for me to try and second guess in a relatively brief lecture about his work. So what I'm going to try to do in what follows is to offer you, as it were, a big picture account of what Nozick was up to. Let me say, then, something about what Nozick's starting point was and that of his book. In the introduction to the book, Nozick actually tells us that his initial concern was to try to refute libertarian ideas. He'd obviously got into discussion with some people who were libertarians. He didn't much like the views, and he was setting out initially, he got interested initially because he wanted to refute these things. He also talks of a discussion that he had with the individualist anarchist thinker, American Murray Rothbard, who's a well-known defender of libertarian views. Indeed, Rothbard thought that individual rights and markets are basically all that you need, that you don't actually need to have the state at all. And it was these kinds of views with which Nozick was engaging. He was initially setting out on this task, as it were, to refute these views. As things happened, Nozick does, in the end, pose some problems for libertarians, and he's critical of individualist anarchism, the sort of viewpoint that Rothbard espouses. But the overall thrust of the book, in the end, is really very sympathetic to libertarian views. And indeed, Nozick has been a very powerful voice for a libertarian perspective. It seemed to give legitimacy to it by virtue of the character of Nozick's arguments, but also, as I've mentioned, because of Nozick's own position. There was indeed a personal friend of mine who was sympathetic to that sort of perspective, who was in academia, who told me until Nozick's book came out, he really couldn't fess up to the kind of views that he had, because his colleagues would film. But now, after Nozick's book came out, he could say, yes, I hold that sort of view, the sort of view that Nozick is exploring in Anarchy, State and Utopia. And so it sort of legitimated that kind of perspective within academia. One other thing which is worth noting, and that is that Nozick's argument is very much based on an appeal to rights, rather than arguments about libertarianism in terms of what the consequences are of a free market system, the kind of thing that one finds, for example, in the work of Friedrich Hayek. What is Nozick's argument all about, then? Well, he starts from individuals in a so-called state of nature, a situation where there isn't government, with rights to their persons and rights to acquire property. This is familiar historically because it's very reminiscent, and indeed Nozick's particular starting point is very reminiscent of what one finds in John Locke. There are, though, some important differences between Nozick and Locke. Locke himself, in his first treatise on government, says that there is a right that people have to charity from the surplus of others, and this kind of notion really doesn't get into Nozick. That kind of material that you get in Locke is cut out of Nozick's approach. Next, in Locke, there's been some controversy about how one's to understand his ideas about rights, but they pretty clearly seem, at least to me, to go back to theological ideas. They're rooted, I think one could argue, quite plausibly, in duties that we have to God. The basis of rights in Nozick is really left unexplained. He certainly doesn't go back to theological ideas. Nozick himself is critical of some of Locke's ideas about how people can initially acquire property rights. Locke gave an account of people mixing their labor with unoccupied land and it becoming theirs. Nozick raises some problems about this. He says, well, it isn't that obvious that if you mix something that's yours with something that isn't, that the thing then becomes yours. And he gives a neat example. He says, take a can of soup and take some lake that's hitherto been undiscovered. You open the can of soup, you swish it around in the lake, and if it's tomato soup, gradually you get the soup spreading out into the lake, but in the end getting thinner and thinner and thinner until it all disappears. And Nozick says it isn't at all obvious that by mixing something of yours with something that isn't yours, it gradually becomes yours. People would normally say, well, you just gradually lose your soup. Okay. So he raised lots of sort of tricksy points like this, but he doesn't himself come along and say, well, these are the defects in Locke's particular account, and my answer to all of these problems is so-and-so. He raises lots and lots of questions, rather than always providing answers to them. I don't think that this necessarily poses a pressing problem for his own work. I mean, clearly anyone can have an open agenda. I think, though, that things get a little more difficult when, as Nozick does, he appeals to some of these notions, for example, ideas about individual property ownership, and uses them as a stick to beat other people with. That's to say, one can give someone a good deal of room to, later in their endeavors to explore particular ideas which they haven't got an answer to now, but if they want, rather than just to using these for filling out their own ideas, to using this as a stick with which to beat other people, then that stick has really got to be pretty well put together. And I think this is a kind of problem in Nozick. What then happens in terms of his reasoning about people moving from a so-called state of nature into a limited government? Well, the idea of a state of nature has been used historically to reflect on government and its proper relation to citizens. It occurs in a number of different thinkers, in Thomas Hobbes, in John Locke, and in some contemporary thinkers. So it's quite a usual but sometimes contested approach. The most useful specific parallel with Nozick's approach is what one finds in Locke. There, individual rights in a state of nature serve as the basis for the powers of government. If you want to check whether what government is doing is legitimate, you have to trace back the powers it's exercising to powers that individuals had in a state of nature, which they can be envisaged as having given to government. It also serves as a source of limitations on the power of government. Now, some people, individualist anarchists, for example, Murray Rothbard, to whom I referred before, would argue that if we started in a Lockean state of nature, we should just simply have stayed there. We should have never set up a state. Indeed, one can compare on this John Locke's own response to Robert Filmer, a contemporary with him defender of royal absolutism. In Locke's second treatise of government, Locke really says the following, that Filmer avoids what mischiefs may be done by foxes, but is content, nay, thinks it safety, to be devoured by lions. The message is really this, that there are problems in the state of nature. Locke moves to set up a state. Locke, looking at Filmer, says, well, I'm concerned about the arguments for absolutism because the kind of state that Filmer is setting up is one which seems to me, Locke, much more dangerous than the problems that we would have without such a state. But essentially what Murray Rothbard and other individualist anarchists do is to say, well, the same is true of you, Locke. Namely, we think that it's the state as a concentration of power which is really dangerous. There may indeed be some problems if you don't have a state, but they're nothing like as difficult and problematic as the kind of problems you'll have if you set up a state. We want to stay in a state of nature. Now, one might say, what is one to make of this sort of suggestion? How could one possibly stay in a situation without government? Locke himself admits that there can be property and commercial activity within a state of nature, but he brings in the notion that you need to set up government because he thinks there can be disputes about property rights and so on, which you can get into within a state of nature, which you can't resolve and which lead to endless quarrels and then eventually to war. You can't have someone in a state of nature who can give you sort of good impartial judgment and who can't enforce the judgment either. You need a state in order to do this. The individualist anarchist says, look, we actually have got suggestions about how you could solve these problems within a state of nature as Locke depicts it. How? Well, you could have private adjudicators. You could have private enforcement agencies. And some of them have spent a long time spelling out how some of these things might work and offering historical parallels and so on. Nozick wants to take on the individualist anarchist, saying, look, I share your starting point, individuals with rights in a state of nature, but I want to show how you could get from this to a minimal state without coercion and without somehow assuming that everyone comes together to make some big agreement. A state can almost come about spontaneously, as if, as Adam Smith would have put it, by an invisible hand, as an unintended consequence of actions that people are taken. How? Well, Nozick offers a rather clever argument, as is quite typical of his approach. He says, first of all, in agreement with the individualist anarchist, if people were in a state of nature and there was problems about judgment and enforcement, one would imagine that private protection agencies of various kinds would be set up. People would employ people, essentially, to offer adjudication and other people to enforce those judgments. Nozick then argues that one could expect these things to lead to a monopoly, or at least cooperation, between such agencies in respect of any one particular geographical area. Why? Well, if you have different sorts of enforcement and people have got different sorts of rights that are going to be enforced in any one space, you'd have a terrible problem. I mean, if someone takes something from someone else and someone else yells, "Stop thief," the police would have to say, well, wait a minute, is this person acting under this law or this law, and can we enforce it? No, what you'd get is a situation, he suggests, which is more like you have between banks, where they provide pretty much the same service, but will typically give other people's customers, say, the use of their ATM machines in return for charging a fee. So what he expects is that in any one geographical area, you'll get a good deal of uniformity. Now, you might say, well, this actually then starts to look like pretty much like the key functions of government, but being provided privately. Well, not quite, because one might say, what about those people who don't want to join up with such agencies? Jonathan Wolfe, who's written about Nozick, refers to these people as John Wayne types, who sort of say, I'll look after myself, I don't want any protection agency. What about these people? Well, the difficulty is that one seems to need an argument as to how these people can be compelled to come into the fold of the services of these agencies which have developed. And Nozick offers an argument to the effect that it is legitimate to compel them to come in and take on board these services. Basically along the lines of saying that other people have got a right to some sort of public and settled procedure when there are disputes, and that private justice imposed by John Wayne types imposes a potential danger on other people. So he says, really, look, what you need and what people are entitled to is regularity in terms of how these things work. The independents who want to enforce the law themselves, they're just wild cards. And what Nozick argues is that it is okay, it isn't infringing the rights of these people to compel them not to be independents and to force them to join a dominant protection agency, but he says, given that you're doing this, you must compensate them by way of extending protection services to them. And by this means, Nozick tries also to address a problem, namely that in any particular geographical area, a state will extend its protection, like police protection and so on, to everyone. You don't get a situation where before the police will help you, they say, are you signed up with us and are you paying taxes? No, what they do is extend those services to everybody. And what Nozick wants to argue is that on this kind of basis, this would be in order, you wouldn't have infringed anybody's rights. The argument is interesting, it's really clever, but you might say, look, okay, but it's really only of interest to people like Murray Rothbard, who are individualist anarchists. I mean, they may get very worked up about this matter as to whether or not one can legitimately get people out of the state of nature and under government. No one else might really care a toss about it. And indeed, what's happened is that it's largely been the individualist anarchists who've taken issue with this particular line of argument in Nozick's work. They indeed have not found it that convincing. They said, look, why are you assuming that it's the independents who are the mavericks? And they want to produce various horror stories about the operation of states in various different areas. They say, can you really depend on the state for justice? Are they really a good example of sort of fair and regular procedure and so on? I'll turn, though, from this, because it becomes a bit of an arcane controversy, to issues raised by Nozick's next line of argument. Namely, because what he wants to say is that while the setting up of a minimal state is okay, anything that goes beyond a minimal state in terms of the exercise of a state's power is morally illegitimate. It involves infringing people's rights. And in this respect, he's taking on the kinds of views that we are used to in terms of the normal sorts of things that governments do. In this section of the lecture, I'm going to talk then about Nozick's criticisms of a redistributionist state, one which is redistributing money by way of taxation. Rather than try to address Nozick's work in a completely systematic way, what I'm going to do is to talk to you about 4 arguments from several arguments that he offers, and also to say a little in more general terms about his ideas about justice. First of all, Nozick offers a criticism of what one might call the democratic legitimation of redistribution. And he does this by way of something that he calls the tale of the slave. Nozick asks us, first of all, to consider a situation in which someone is a slave, they have a brutal master, and really their life is not their own. He then asks us to consider gradual transitions from that situation, perhaps to a situation where there's yourself and various other slaves, that the master says, okay, we will give all the slaves a vote as to what tasks different people are going to be performing, and then you get your orders from that. And he moves up by stages and stages and stages to a situation where essentially what you have are collective decisions being taken by all the group. You have a vote in them, but you have to do what the outcome of this group of people decides. So there's slow gradations up to what, in effect, is a depiction of democracy. And what Nozick says is, well, at the end stage, you will be in a situation in which, if there is in all other respects a tie with regard to votes, then your vote may be crucial, and that may then decide what you're going to do or how much tax you're going to pay or whatever. And Nozick asks of this, at what point in this story, moving by slow gradations, do people become free? Now, clearly, what he's up to here is essentially saying that in a democratic system like ours, our own vote is seldom, indeed, I think, in the experience of any of us, never going to be in a situation where it is crucial in terms of deciding an outcome. And I think Nozick is suggesting, look, the situation under which you're free is when you have your rights protected, when you're entitled to your own property, but there is something decidedly unfree about the ordinary notion of democracy, where what you do, how you're taxed and so on is just up to collective decision-making. You, to be sure, have a tiny say in this, but it's a say which normally actually doesn't count one way or the other in terms of the decision. A second line of argument is about self-ownership and a critique of taxation. What he there really says is the following, that if we are taxed, then you don't, in a sense, fully own yourself. He says taxation is, in a way, a little bit on a par with forced labor. That, in a sense, you're doing things, but for a certain point of what you're not doing them for you, you're doing them for someone else. It's as if other people collectively owned you for part of the time. And what Nozick wants to do is to problematize and to ask us to question something that we normally now just take for granted. Nozick, it should be said, is perfectly happy with voluntary charitable giving. Indeed, he'd recommend it strongly. He favors it. It's coercion. It's the coerced taking of your resources and the diverting of them into various other plans and other concerns that he's critical of. The next line of argument uses as an example round Wilt Chamberlain, someone who, as someone who's not an American, understands to be a player of some kind of American sport. Wilt Chamberlain, Nozick says, became wealthy because people wanted to pay to watch him play. And Nozick said, look, his wealth in these cases would be the product of all kinds of voluntary transactions. I mean, that, you know, when he was famous, if he was transferred to another club, they could put up the prices because people would be very happy to pay a bit more so as to see him play. And what Nozick really wants to do is to say, look, that is the key question to ask, namely, are the transactions voluntary? If the result is someone is extremely well off, well, what one has to ask about this is, did he get it by fair means? Did people agree to it? Did people voluntarily do that? And that, in Nozick's view, is the end of the story. Indeed, he wants to say preventing such voluntary transactions between adults means that you're infringing their liberty, you're violating their rights. And he also wants to say that if, by way of contrast to this, you say, no, what has to happen is that the government has to pursue concerns about equality, that it would constantly be having to interfere in all sorts of voluntary transactions that are taking place between individuals. Even if we had a situation where everyone was equal, if there could be voluntary transactions, then there would be emerging inequalities. And if you insist on equality, then it means that the government has to keep on coming in and interfering. Finally, in this area, he offers a critique of the philosopher John Rawls and of some of Rawls's arguments for disregarding how it is that things come to be owned. Rawls suggests that we should discuss issues about, essentially, a constitution and how things should be distributed from, as it were, behind a veil of ignorance, a situation where we imagine that we don't know what position we would be holding in a particular society, and considering what would be just or fair, not knowing what position we'd end up in. Nozick wants to say, well, look, there's a problem about this because it ends up dissociating individuals and the particular positions that they hold. It dissociates individuals and, in particular, the production of wealth. It treats wealth as if it was just manna coming down from heaven rather than being something which was actually being produced by particular individuals to which they then have ties, which ties, he wants to say, really mean that it isn't just free for us to redistribute as we might see fit. Behind all of this lies his view about justice. The key issue for Nozick are notions of entitlement rather than patterns, for example, equality. So, for example, if there's a question about the legitimacy of someone's holdings, of their wealth, one must ask, is this possession justly acquired by that individual or legitimately acquired from someone who themselves acquired it justly? If it isn't justly acquired, there may be a historically based case for compensation, for example, for people's being dispossessed. This, I think, is an interesting approach, but it suggests that there are no problems about wealth if the path to acquisition was okay. Is this acceptable? Well, what about huge inequalities? What about huge amounts of wealth? What about the case where people were just wealthy because they inherited money from other people? Is that okay? Do people simply have a right to dispose of their property as they choose? Nozick, I think, would say yes, that they've got rights to this. Other people might say, no, there's a problem about it, there's a difficulty about it. Nozick's approach isn't completely okay. There are different intuitions here. Nozick's approach, though, I think is weakened because, as I mentioned before, he doesn't really offer an explanation of how people could justly acquire things in the first place. Although this, though, doesn't mean that his argument collapses. Nozick's notions about self-ownership, the Wilt Chamberlain example, and the arguments about the slave are provocative, and I think the argument about entitlements is also forceful, provided that people will grant that there are notions about just entitlements. Before I finish this part of the discussion, I'd like to make 3 other brief points about his work. He wants to stress that individuals have, as constraints on what other people can do, rights. He describes these things as side constraints. You mustn't infringe on other people's rights. He argues for a respecting of each individual's rights rather than some notion of a maximization of how many rights everyone can enjoy, what he calls a utilitarianism of rights. And he also wants to insist that rights mustn't be infringed. And you may say, well, never infringed? What about a situation where something really dire would happen if a right wasn't infringed? Say there's some train smash or something. To get help, you have to go and telephone. A farmer says, well, that would mean crossing my field. It's mine. You don't have a right to do that. Nozick says, if there is a real disaster that would follow, then, okay, the right can be infringed, but only in those cases. What are we to make of Nozick? Well, I would stress, first of all, that he offers stimulating and very clever argument. He poses lots of problems for welfare liberals on the basis of how liberty and individual rights are widely understood in America. The key weakness of his work, I think, is that rather too much depends on undefended assumptions. He has himself, in a later book, An Examined Life, indicated that he now has some reservations about the earlier work, but he hasn't really indicated in much detail what they are. He says, well, issues about public celebration of identity are important, and these have to be brought into qualified, but he hasn't really engaged with his academic critics and so on. There is, however, a final section of his book on utopia, which seems to me really to be very interesting. In this, he discusses the notion of a so-called minimal state and private property rights as offering a framework within which people can live diverse lives. I mean, just think of the diversity of different people that there are, the different ideals that they may have, the different notions that they might have as to what a good life consists of. And what Nozick says is, look, why not allow people to separate, to pursue these different ideals with like-minded people, rather than committing everyone to doing everything together. He also says if you allow for this, then we can also learn from other people's mistakes. We can see these as trials of different ways of doing things, as different experiments in living, provided, that is, that other people will allow us the freedom to do these things. What we have done in this lecture is to start with some preliminaries about Nozick's work. We looked at the starting point of his argument. We've explored briefly his arguments for the legitimacy of a minimal state. We've looked at his challenges to a notion of the state which would go beyond that. And then we have looked at some of the critical reception of his work, and finally at the, in my view, unduly neglected utopia section of his book. Thank you very much.